Groups. Todd Ashker, a convicted murderer, spent over 20 years in the Security Housing Unit, or SHU, in Pelican Bay, a maximum security prison in fog-filled Crescent City in Northern California. The idea behind the SHU was to isolate gang members from other gang members. Ashker was a member of the Aryan Brotherhood. In solitary confinement in the SHU, Ashker spent 23 hours a day by himself in a windowless cell, about the size of a parking space, often staring at the walls for hours. He could exercise 1 hour a day by himself in a moldy enclosed space with no clear view of the sky. He could see no other prisoners and received his meals through a slot in the door to his cell. When his family or friends were permitted to visit, he was not allowed to touch them. When social psychologist Craig Hanley first interviewed a sample of SHU prisoners, he found the effects of solitary confinement to be devastating. 70% of SHU prisoners showed signs of impending nervous breakdown, 40% suffered from hallucinations, and 27% had suicidal ideation. One SHU inmate summed it up aptly: "I would rather have gotten the death penalty." In the despair of solitary confinement, Ashker did something extraordinary. He formed a group with the leaders of rival gangs in cells nearby. Desperate for human contact, prisoners began calling out to one another when in the exercise room. In a series of conversations, the leaders of the rival gangs talked about their parents and grandparents, their children and spouses, their neighborhoods and pasts. They talked about the profound suffering produced by solitary confinement. Moved by these conversations, Ashker and his neighbors called for a truce between the rival gangs, and on July 8, 2013, Ashker led a hunger strike that, through informal word of mouth, involved over 30,000 prisoners in California, all protesting solitary confinement as a violation of the Eighth Amendment of the Constitution, which prohibits the use of cruel and unusual punishment. Ashker's efforts inspired a team of lawyers to sue the state of California to free prisoners from solitary confinement in the SHU. The case involved several social psychologists, including an author of this book, who relied on findings you are learning about to make the case that solitary confinement is indeed cruel and unusual punishment. Humans have a drive-like need to belong and connect. See Chapter 10. In fact, isolation, exclusion, and rejection activate the pain centers of the brain much as physical harm does, and when humans are deprived of touch, their stress system can go on overdrive. In 2015, the case was settled in favor of the prisoners, and over 2,000 prisoners across California were moved out of solitary confinement. There are many lessons to be learned from Todd Ashker's experience of solitary confinement. When we are denied the chance to connect and be in groups, we suffer in profound ways. Our humanity is found in group life. The importance of group life, a prison cell right, and the exercise area left in the security housing unit at Pelican Bay. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. John Donne, English poet. The nature and purpose of group living. What happened to Todd Ashker in the SHU at Pelican Bay speaks to our fundamentally social nature. Humans and all large primates, except orangutans, live in groups, so group life must provide advantages. Today it's recognized that our capacity to form groups has helped us meet many of the challenges of survival and the reproduction of our genes. In groups, we provide care for our extremely vulnerable offspring, find protection from predators, enjoy increased efficiency in acquiring and sharing food, and bolster our defense against aggressors. These benefits of group living are so crucial to survival that we have a psychological need to be with others and belong in groups. But what exactly is a group? This is not an easy question to answer, since there are so many types of groups, and they don't always share many features. The members of a baseball team are clearly a group, but most people wouldn't consider the members of a large lecture course to be a group. Similarly, Most people would say that the individuals riding together in an elevator aren't a group. But suppose the elevator breaks down, and those inside must figure out how to escape or summon help. Most would say that the people in the elevator now seem more like a real group. But why? A group has been described as a collection of individuals who have relations to one another that make them interdependent to some significant degree. Thus, the people in the functioning elevator don't make up a group because they're not interdependent, but once the elevator breaks down and they must decide on joint action, or whether to take joint action, they become interdependent and hence more of a group. There are degrees of interdependence, of course, and therefore degrees of groupness. The members of a family are more of a real group than are participants in a seminar, and seminar attendees, in turn, are more of a group than are students in a large lecture course. By this reasoning, a nation's citizens make up something of a group, but they are less of a group than the members of a tribe or band, who interact more often and are more directly dependent on one another. This chapter explores how groups function, how they make decisions, and how group decision making can go wrong. It also examines how people achieve positions of leadership within a group, as well as the effects of power on people. Finally, the chapter explores how orderly groups can devolve into unruly mobs when its members' personal identities are diminished. Social facilitation. Let's begin by considering one of the simplest questions about social life. What effect does the presence of other people have on individual performance? Does the presence of others typically help or hinder performance, or does it have no effect at all? To address these questions, let's consider them in more personal and vivid terms. Suppose you're by yourself as you try to perfect a skill, practicing a chord progression on the guitar, mastering a tricky dance move, or working through the intricacies of conjugating French verbs. You feel you're making progress when someone, a perfect stranger, your mother, or even say Amy Schumer or W. Camus Bell, takes a seat nearby and proceeds to observe. What does this other person's presence do to your performance? Does it give you the energy and focus necessary to bring your performance to new heights? Or do you become so nervous and distracted that your performance suffers? Outline: the nature and purpose of group living, social facilitation, group decision-making, leadership and power, de-individuation, and the psychology of mobs. Initial research. Norman Triplett, 1898, is often credited with being the first person to experimentally examine the effect of other people's presence on human performance. Triplett was a bicycling enthusiast, or wheelman as they were known at the time. After reviewing speed records put out by the Racing Board of the League of American Wheelmen, Triplett noticed that the fastest times were recorded when cyclists competed directly against one another on the same track at the same time. Slower speed records were obtained when cyclists raced alone against the clock. This observation led Triplett to hypothesize that the presence of others tended to facilitate human performance. Triplett realized, however, that cycling records did not offer the best test of his hypothesis, so he conducted what is widely considered social psychology's first experiment. 1898. He invited a group of 40 children to his laboratory and had them turn a fishing reel as fast as they could. Each child did so on 6 trials. On 3 of the trials, the child was alone. On the other 3 trials, another child was alongside doing the same thing. Under these more controlled conditions, Triplett found that the children tended to turn the reel faster when in the presence of another child engaged in the same activity. The presence of others appeared to facilitate their performance. Research on this subject thus came to be known as social facilitation research. Social facilitation, initially a term for enhanced performance in the presence of others, now a broader term for the effect, positive or negative, of the presence of others on performance. The bodily presence of another contestant participating in the race serves to liberate latent energy not ordinarily available. Norman Triplett. A number of subsequent experiments reinforced Triplett's findings and extended them in 2 important ways. First, the same effects were obtained when the others were not doing the same thing, that is, not co-acting, but were merely present as an audience of passive observers. Second, the same effect was also observed in a vast number of animal species, indicating that the phenomenon is quite general and fundamental. For example, animals as diverse as dogs, fish, armadillos, opossums, and frogs have been shown to eat more when in the presence of other members of the same species than when alone. Ants dig more earth, fruit flies do more preening, and centipedes run faster through mazes, when together than when alone. For both humans and other animals, then, the presence of others seems to facilitate performance, but numerous exceptions emerged soon after Triplett's original findings. Floyd Allport, 1920, for example, asked undergraduate students to refute philosophical arguments as best they could in a 5-minute period. The students provided higher quality refutations when working alone than when working in the presence of another student. The presence of others has also been shown to inhibit performance on arithmetic problems, memory tasks, and maze learning. And the presence of other members of the same species has sometimes been found to inhibit the performance of non-human species. Social facilitation and competition. Performance is typically enhanced in the presence of others when the activity is well learned, as cycling is for Vincenzo Nibali of Italy, shown here entering Paris as the winner of Le Tour de France 2014. Resolving the contradictions. For a time then, it seemed that the best generalization available about the effect of the presence of others on performance was that it sometimes helps and sometimes hurts, not a terribly satisfying answer. It's about as helpful as an expert saying we might be headed for another economic crash, but then again, we might not, although that may be all you'd expect from someone trying to predict which way the economy is going. You probably want more from researchers studying a simpler process like social facilitation. Zajonk's theory of mere presence. Nearly 70 years after Triplett's discovery, social psychologist Robert Zajonc offered an elegant theory to account for the divergent findings on this topic. Zajonc, 1965, argued that the presence of others, indeed the mere presence of others, tends to facilitate performance on simple or well-learned tasks, but it hinders performance on difficult or novel tasks. Even more importantly, Zajonc's theory explained why the presence of others has these effects. Zajonc's theory has 3 components. Figure 12.1. First, the mere presence of others makes us more aroused. Other people are dynamic and unpredictable stimuli, capable of doing almost anything at any time. We therefore need to be alert or aroused in their presence so we can react to what they might do. Second, arousal tends to make us more rigid and narrowly focused, in the sense that we become even more inclined to do what we're already automatically inclined to do. In the language Zajonc used, arousal makes us more likely to make a dominant response. Think of it like this. In any situation, you can respond in a variety of ways, arranged in a hierarchy according to their likelihood of occurrence. Whatever you're most inclined to do in that situation is at the top of the hierarchy and thus the dominant response. When aroused, Zajonc argued, people are even more inclined to make that dominant response. Dominant response. In a person's hierarchy of possible responses in any context, the response that person is most likely to make. The third component to Zajonc's theory specifies that the increase in dominant response tendencies leads to the facilitation of performance on simpler tasks and the inhibition of performance on complex tasks. For easy or well-learned tasks, the dominant response is likely to be the correct response. In fact, that's tantamount to what it means for a task to be easy or well-learned. Thus, the presence of other people, by facilitating the dominant response, facilitates the correct response and improves performance. In contrast, for difficult or novel tasks, the dominant response is not likely to be the correct response. Again, that's what it means for a task to be difficult or novel. Thus, the presence of others facilitates an incorrect response and hinders performance. Figure 12.1. Zajonc's model of social facilitation. The presence of others, indeed their mere presence, increases arousal and facilitates dominant response tendencies. This improves performance on easy or well-learned tasks, but hinders performance on difficult or novel tasks. Okay, so it's a flowchart, and at the top, it starts with, in the middle, the mere presence of others, which leads to arousal, which leads to an increase in dominant response tendencies, and then it splits off to the left. So increase in dominant response tendencies on simple or well-learned tasks, the dominant response is the correct response, and thus performance is facilitated. So, and then when on the other side of the flowchart on the right side, when there's an increase in dominant response tendencies on difficult or novel tasks, the dominant response is an incorrect response, which leads to performance is impaired. Testing the theory. Zajong's theory synthesized the diverse findings that existed at the time and has been tested in a number of studies across species. For example, Zajong and his colleagues placed cockroaches in the start box of one or of two mazes and then shone a light at the start box. Cockroaches instinctively flee from light and head toward a dark area. In this case, the cockroaches would try to reach the dark goal box. In the simple maze, a runaway, getting to the darkened chamber was easy. The cockroach needed only to do what it does instinctively, run directly away from the light, its dominant response. In contrast, getting to the darkened chamber in the complex maze was more of a challenge. The cockroach had to do more than follow its instincts and flee from the light. It had to execute a turn. Two features of this setup were especially important. First, because cockroaches invariably run from light, doing so is clearly their dominant response. Second, Zajong created two different conditions. In one, the dominant response led to the goal, the simple maze. In the other, it did not, the complex maze. Zajong had the cockroaches run one of these two mazes either alone or with another cockroach. He predicted that cockroaches running the simple maze would get to the goal box more quickly when together than when alone, but that those running the complex maze together would take longer to reach the chamber. That's exactly what happened. The presence of another cockroach facilitated performance on the simple maze, but hindered performance on the complex maze. Figure 12.2. Okay, everybody, stay quiet. I hear Bob coming. Happy birthday. Bob turns on the light and all the cockroaches zip away. Why cockroaches give lousy surprise parties? Co-acting versus mere presence. To show that the mere presence of another cockroach has these effects, as opposed to some other, more complex factor than the presence of others of the same species, such as competition, Zajong added a condition in which the cockroach ran the maze not with another cockroach running alongside, but with the other cockroaches merely present as a passive audience. To create this condition, Zajong built a set of plexiglass boxes or grandstands that flanked the two mazes and then filled them with observer cockroaches. Again, as figure 12.2 indicates, the presence of the observing cockroaches facilitated performance on the simple maze, but inhibited performance on the complex maze. Subsequent tests of Zajong's theory turned to the real-world behavior of our own species. For example, consider one study conducted at a university pool hall, 1982. College students playing recreational pool were unobtrusively observed and deemed skilled or unskilled based on their performance. Zajong's theory predicts that the presence of an audience should make the skilled players perform better. For them, the task is easy, and the unskilled players perform worse. For them, the task is difficult. To test this prediction, the experimenters walked up to the pool tables and watched. As expected, the good players did even better than before, and the poor players did even worse. Figure 12.2, social facilitation in another species. For cockroaches, as for humans, the presence of others increases dominant response tendencies, leading to better performance on easy tasks, in this case the simple maze, and worse performance on difficult tasks, the complex maze. Okay, so you can see you have, in the simple maze, the cockroach needs only to follow its dominant response and run directly away from the light to get to the goal. So you can see it's a box with a tunnel in the middle, and the light on one side and the goal at the end of the tunnel that's dark, so the cockroach can just run straight. In the complex maze, the cockroach's dominant response does not easily lead it to the goal. The cockroach must execute a turn. Okay, so in this one you can see the darkened goal is to the left. In the middle of the tunnel, you turn left away from the light. Average time in seconds taken by cockroaches to negotiate simple or complex mazes when alone or alongside another cockroach. Okay, so on the x-axis, there's alone and co-action, and on the y-axis, there's running time. It looks like in seconds from 0 to 120. Okay, so alone, you can see that it takes about 40 seconds to run the maze, the simple maze by themselves, and about 38 seconds maybe to run the simple maze with co-action. So it's faster when another cockroach is running alongside them. And for the complex maze, when running alone, it takes about 110 seconds, whereas with another cockroach running beside them, it takes about 125 seconds, so the cockroach is slower. Average time to negotiate simple or complex mazes when alone or in the presence of an audience. So the x-axis is alone and audience this time, and the y-axis is running time from 0 to 300 seconds. So when the cockroach is alone, it takes them about 55 seconds to run the simple maze, and when they have an audience, it takes them maybe like 48 seconds, so they're faster. And for the complex maze, when they're alone, it takes them about 220 seconds to run the maze, whereas when they have an audience, it takes them almost 300 seconds. Mere presence or evaluation apprehension. Zhejiang's theory has stood the test of time, with many studies finding that the presence of others tends to facilitate performance on easy tasks and hinders performance on difficult tasks. One element of Zhejiang's theory, however, has been disputed, whether it is the mere presence of other people that increases arousal. When most people reflect on why they would be aroused in the presence of others, it's not just their presence that seems decisive. Instead, it's evaluation apprehension, a concern about looking bad in the eyes of others, about being evaluated, that seems to be important. Several studies have purported to show that it is only when subjects feel they are being evaluated that they show arousal and consequent facilitation on easy tasks and impairment on difficult tasks. Testing for evaluation apprehension. A number of social psychologists have argued that evaluation apprehension, not mere presence, is the critical element underlying social facilitation. To test this hypothesis experimentally, there must be 3 conditions: one with the subject performing alone, one with the subject performing in front of an evaluative audience, and one with the subject performing in front of an audience that cannot evaluate the subject's performance. In one such study, the investigators cleverly built from scratch a response hierarchy in their participants so they'd know exactly what the dominant and subordinate responses were. 1968. They gave the participants a list of 10 nonsense words, such as Nansoma, Aperitif, and Zebulon, and had them pronounce 2 of the 10 words once, 2 words twice, 2 words 5 times, 2 words 10 times, and 2 words 25 times. The participants were thus much more familiar with some of the words than with others. After this initial training phase of the experiment, the test phase began. Participants were told that these same words would be flashed on a screen very briefly, some so briefly they might not be visible, and that their task was to identify each word as it was shown. If they couldn't identify a word, they should guess. Unbeknownst to the participants, none of the target words was actually shown, and they were reduced to guessing on every trial. This task is thus known as the pseudo-recognition test. The participants performed this task either 1 alone, 2 in the presence of 2 other students who watched the proceedings attentively, or 3 in the presence of blindfolded observers. The blindfolds in the latter, mere presence condition, were supposedly to prepare the blindfolded individuals for an experiment in perception, but in reality, their purpose was to make it clear to the participants that these individuals could not evaluate them. The researchers were interested in how often the participants gave a dominant response by guessing the most familiar word, those they had pronounced 25 times, and how this rate varied across the three conditions. The results, shown in Figure 12.3, highlight the importance of evaluation apprehension. Participants performing in front of an evaluative audience made more dominant responses than those performing alone. Those performing in front of a blindfolded audience did not. Thus, the audience that couldn't evaluate what was going on had no effect on performance. This experiment seems to demonstrate rather conclusively that it's the concern about others as a source of evaluation, and not their mere presence, that's responsible for social facilitation. Testing for mere presence. More careful scrutiny, however, gives rise to doubts about the results of the experiment just described. More specifically, although participants in the alone condition were alone in an objective sense, no one else was physically present, they may not have been psychologically alone. After all, they were in an experiment, one in which they were asked to perform a strange task. It seems likely that they might feel apprehensive about the prospect of their performance being surreptitiously recorded, which it was. Thus, the alone condition used in this study may not have been a true alone condition. To adequately test Zajonk's theory, then, it is essential to create a condition in which participants feel that they are truly alone. In an ingenious experiment, Hazel Marcus, 1978, showed that the mere presence of another person, in the absence of any concern about that person being evaluative, is indeed sufficient to create arousal that facilitates performance on an easy task and impairs performance on a difficult task. When participants arrived individually for the experiment, they were told to go into an adjoining room to wait for the other participants to arrive. While there, they had to put on the necessary attire for the experiment, take off their own shoes, put on a pair of lab socks over their own socks, put on a pair of oversized lab shoes, and put on a similarly oversized lab coat. The participants did all this and waited in vain for the other participants to arrive. In reality, there were no other participants. After 10 minutes, the experimenter reappeared and stated that the other participants were apparently not coming, and the experiment would have to be scratched. The participants were then instructed to change back into their own clothes. Unbeknownst to participants, all of this changing of clothes was surreptitiously observed and timed through a one-way mirror. Marcus was interested in how quickly participants could perform the novel tasks of putting on and taking off the unfamiliar lab coat, socks, and shoes, as well as how quickly they could perform the well-learned tasks of taking off and putting on their own very familiar shoes. Participants did this in one of three conditions: alone, with another person watching attentively, or in the mere presence of a repairman working on a piece of apparatus with his back to the participant. Even though the participants did not think they were performing, Zajonk's theory predicts that they should change their own clothes faster, and the novel clothes more slowly when in the mere presence of another person. As shown in Table 12.1, see page 418, that's exactly what happened. Participants took off and put on their own shoes more quickly, and the experimenters' shoes, socks, and coat more slowly, when in the presence of another person, even when the other person had his back turned and was unable to observe. Thus, when a true alone condition is included, an effect of the mere presence of someone else can be observed. Note again that the effects were stronger for an attentive audience than for a merely present audience, but that's not a problem for the theory. It just means that evaluation apprehension can add to a person's arousal and thus intensify the effect of mere presence. These results, and those of similar investigations, strongly support Zajonk's theory that the mere presence of another does indeed have an effect on performance. Table 12.1, Social Facilitation and the Effect of an Audience. Okay, so it's a two-way table, and the columns are alone, merely present audience, and attentive audience, and the rows are well-learned tasks, own shoes, and novel tasks, lab shoes, socks, and coat. So if you look at the amount of seconds that these different conditions took, so when you look at the well-learned tasks of putting on your own shoes, for example, you're the fastest at putting them on with an attentive audience at about 12 seconds, and the second fastest with a merely present audience at 13.5 seconds, and you're the slowest at putting them on when you're alone at 16.5 seconds, which makes sense because you're facilitated by the audience. And for novel tasks, putting on the lab shoes, socks, and coat, you can see that you're the fastest at doing it alone at 29 seconds, the second fastest at doing it with a merely present audience at 33 seconds, and you're the slowest at putting on the lab coat and the novel items with an attentive audience at 34 seconds. So a difficult task is slowed down by the fact that other people are around, and it's slowed down the most when someone is attentive versus someone who is just present. Figure 12.3, Evaluation Apprehension and Social Facilitation. This graph shows the average number of dominant responses made by participants who were responding alone next to a blindfolded audience who therefore couldn't monitor or evaluate their performance, or next to an attentive audience who could evaluate their performance. Participants were more likely to exhibit dominant responses in the presence of an attentive audience, but not a merely present, blindfolded audience. So this is the fake words test. Okay, so it's a bar graph, and the three categories on the x-axis are evaluative audience, blindfolded audience, and alone, and the y-axis is the number of dominant responses from 0 to 16. So you can see only an evaluative audience affected the dominant response rate, and you can see responses in front of a blindfolded audience were comparable to those when the participant was alone. Okay, so when there's an evaluative audience, your number of dominant responses is about 14. But when you either have a blindfolded audience or you're alone, your number of dominant responses is lower at only about 9.5. But the issue with this experiment is that basically the alone condition was the same as the blindfolded observer condition, because in the alone condition, the participants knew that they weren't really alone, which is why they then did the second experiment with putting on the lab shoes and coat and socks, when the participants really did think that they were alone and no experiment was occurring. And then you do see the difference of having even the mere presence of another person, and then the effect is the strongest when you have an attentive audience. So you are more aroused with an audience, even if they're not attentive, but you're the most aroused by an audience if they are attentive. Dominant responses and social facilitation. People tend to do better on well-learned tasks, but worse on difficult or poorly mastered tasks in the presence of others. Presumably, the children who know the material well will do better on these standardized tests in the presence of other test takers because their dominant responses will be correct, but children who don't know the material well will be more likely to give incorrect answers in the presence of others.